Dan, there are a lot of significant figures in West Virginia, political, economic, sports. So you could have picked a lot of people. Why'd you pick Hot Rod Hundley?
Hot Rod Hundley is one of the most interesting sports figures of all time in West Virginia for sure. But I think nationally, when you start to look at him, he has one of the most interesting stories that I've ever seen. For what happened to him as a child, for what happened to him, for what he did as a player. There are things that he did on the basketball floor that no one has ever done at that time, but since. And I think that's what made him so interesting.
Tony, what drew you to the story?
Well, right after his passing in March of 2015, Dan and I were talking, and we both kind of came to the agreement that in West Virginia, he is revered as one of the all-time great players, but not so much as a broadcaster. And then if you were to go west of the Mississippi, they know him more as a broadcaster and didn't realize he was an All-American player, the first pick in the NBA draft. And then that's just a part of it. The other part of it is a wild life and an unusual life that he lived. So that started it. And then when we started to kind of pull back the pieces of it, we just continued to shake our head and say, this is an amazing story.
People knew, and particularly West Virginians knew, or people who follow basketball knew, he had a rough upbringing in Charleston, West Virginia, that he played at WVU, that he was
started to peel back is that upbringing. It used to be kind of, a bunch of different people raised Hot Rod in Charleston and he hung out at pool halls. That was kind of the general spin on it. Well, there was a lot more to that than just a kid that was passed around. A very detailed start to the movie, talks about literally his mom's words from one of the books that were written about how he was abused early on when she would leave them with people when he was a toddler, and then how that impacted his entire life from that point on. He raised himself. He was living by himself as a junior and senior in high school, and that lifestyle really never left him. He was always, in some form or fashion, looking back at that time growing up.
Dan, what did you see when you began to dig deeper?
You saw a very complex figure. You saw somebody that left an incredible impact on everybody who met him. It wasn't just people who knew him for, let's say, a year or knew him for 5 years. If you met him, you had a story about him. It was amazing the number of the through lines that people were able to share. There was stories about him and how notorious he was about his tightwadness. If you went out with him, you were going to pick up the bill. And we didn't have to ask people about that. They openly shared those stories. So those sort of things just jumped right off the page at you. And everybody had a story about Hot Rod Hundley and the impact that he made on them.
You talked to a lot of people and some very well-known broadcasters, family members. Did the stories start to take on a similar arc as you talked to them?
I think it did. I think that the people that knew him the best knew that there was an undercurrent that he didn't necessarily talk about a lot, but they knew about it. And especially when we talked to the family, they were able to uncover a lot of the layers that others maybe weren't as willing to talk about. You could see it in their eyes, but maybe they just chose not to go there. But yes, you could see the arc. And overall, though, the popularity of Hot Rod, particularly in Salt Lake City, was what wowed me the most. That's probably the biggest impact that I left with. To this day, he is still a wildly popular figure out there. He's not been broadcasting for a number of years, but to this day, he is still extremely popular.
Again, the well-known story is Hot Rod, always fun, the party, gregarious, likable. People wanted to be around him. But Tony, there was that other side that you all also, that story you tried to find and tell. What part of that story stands out in this piece?
I think what it is a story of redemption, basketball-wise. As a player,
Because
as a player in the National Basketball Association, he did not live up to expectations. He was the first pick in the NBA draft, but only lasted 6 years in the league and made 2 All-Star teams, which is very respectable. But he knew, and those around him knew, that he could have been much better, and he said that. I blew my chances because the Lakers, who drafted him at the time, were in Minneapolis, then moved to Los Angeles. And that's kind of like giving a torch to an arsonist because that lifestyle was exactly what he loved. And as a result, it took away from his career. So that ended prematurely. He knew that. When broadcasting came as an opportunity, he thoroughly embraced it. I mean, tremendously embraced it. And then made one of the most difficult transitions that anyone has ever made. And that is former player becoming play-by-play announcer. Now, everyone knows that former players kind of fall into being color analysts. No one at that point had ever been a former player turned play-by-play announcer and then to become a lead announcer of an NBA team as the play-by-play guy. It's a different deal. And he took that opportunity a second go-around in the league, not as a player, but to stay with the game as a broadcaster, and he became a Hall of Fame broadcaster.
Dan, a lot of the story hinges on the interviews with his children. And they provide a very unique perspective because they had a complicated relationship with their father. What was it?
All of them had a little bit of a different take, I think. But the redemption that, or I guess I should say the forgiveness that they had with their father towards the end was particularly poignant.
Because he wasn't around.
He was not around. They were in Phoenix, or I should say they were in New Orleans living together, and things were not working out there. And ultimately, the 3 daughters and his wife Flo, they moved back to Phoenix, and Hot Rod stayed in New Orleans when he was working there for the New Orleans Jazz. And at that time, they did not live together. After that, they were apart for the rest of their lives. They did not live together. And I think that left a deep impact on the daughters. And from then on, he would visit them at times. But as the one daughter, Jennifer, said, she just thought that was normal. That's just kind of how life was, that your dad lived in another town and he worked somewhere else. So to see the impact that made on their lives, but he was still there. He was still their dad. And he would come around and he would be a part of their lives, but it wasn't persistent. And so to hear the stories of how he would still interact with them and how this relationship became repaired, it seems, at the end, and to hear them talk about, especially when he had Alzheimer's, and to hear the stories at the end and how he passed away, that was very poignant and very moving when they talked about it.
Tony, that seems like a really, that completes the circle in the piece that you all did of his daughters and their father reconciling.
They did. At the end of it all, despite his pain that he went through as a young man and carried with him for his entire life, and the pain that the daughters experienced because of the unique situation of their family, at the end they gained a very good understanding, and actually it happened in Morgantown. All 3 of them say when his number was retired at WVU, that weekend was the weekend where they fully gained an appreciation and a good understanding for the first time of what their dad's life was and why he was the way that he was. And at that point, I think for the rest of his life and their lives, they had a peace about that. And I think at his passing, they were at peace with him. He was at peace with them. And it was a best possible scenario.
Finally, guys, and Tony, I'll start with you. When you say this is, the story of Hot Rod Hundley, and you think of him as a basketball player, but it's not just the story of a basketball player. What's this story about?
Oh, this story, Hoppy, is a life story. This is a story that happens to be involving basketball, but this is a story of life. This is a story of survival. He used basketball his entire life as a tool to survive. I think that, we went into this thing, Hoppy, and we did not want to make this 2 different things. We did not want to make this a fluff piece, and we did not want to make this a negative piece. We wanted it to be a truthful piece, and I think we've accomplished that. And his daughter, Kim, who's kind of the oldest and the one that's been great with us, when she watched it for the first time, she was good with it. And despite the fact that there are things in there that some people would like to keep quiet, it was they were wonderful. The three daughters were wonderful and really speaking from their heart. And so this is the true story. I think for the first time, this is a real story. He wrote 2 books. One was The Clown, and did another one later on in his life. But this was as real as you could get it. And so it's not a hack shot at somebody, and at the same time, it's not a fluff piece. It's the real deal, and I think that's why people will resonate around this.
Dan, how did you find the balance in this? Because it could have been a puff piece. It could have been you could have ripped him. So how did you find the balance?
I agree. I think you have to, it was a delicate balance because either side you could have taken either side of this, but in the edit, it came across that, and then when you go back and watch it, that's how it turned out. Not necessarily intentionally that I was paying attention to that as it went through the edit, but when you came through and you watched it, you go, it's up to the viewer to decide on their own what they feel. And also, if you wanted to put every detail of Hot Rod's life in here, this would be 6 hours long. It's amazing what happened to this guy in his life and the number of incredible stories. There are so many things that happened to this guy, one after the other. And so for this guy to go through what he did early in his life and then to do the things that he did and to impact the number of people that he did, it is an amazing story. So we tried to condense it down as much as we could and to impact an audience and give them the story. So to allow them to make up their own mind to who this guy was. Because he was, I think, one of the most interesting, complex, accomplished athletes and people that have ever been a part of sports in this country for what he's done, not only on the floor, but off the floor. He just happened to be in West Virginia and Utah, 2 states that are very parallel. They just happen to be on different parts of the country.
Anything else you want to add?
It was an amazing project to work on. It's going to be 3 years in April from when we started, and we're very much looking forward now to getting it out there so that people, as Dan said, can make their interpretation of what it was and who he was. And I do think we've got a piece here that'll stand the test of time that gives folks the real story. There's so many times you'd heard Hot Rod Hundley stories here in Morgantown or from Mountaineer fans. Oh, I remember the time that he ran through the stands and he got a hot dog, and you kind of always looked at it with like a raised eyebrow going, come on, that couldn't have happened. Well, yeah, it did. And we have it on tape, and we have it from guys that played with him. And so it's the real deal.
I would say I interviewed him one time when I was here at West Virginia University getting my master's degree, and I'd always heard the stories as well. And from that time forward, I always wanted to know a little bit more behind the layers. Okay, there's something else there, and I wanted to know what was up with this guy, and so that was the thing that drove me on this piece. And so I wanted to give people a view of what this guy really was. It's so much more than just Hot Rod, that's just Hot Rod, that's Hot Rod. And so I think this piece gives a view to that.